Alexander Dolgun was born on September 29, 1926, in the Bronx, New York, to Michael Dolgun, an immigrant from Poland, and his wife Annie. In 1933, Michael traveled to the Soviet Union as a short-term technician at the Moscow Automotive Works. After a year in Moscow, Michael agreed to another one-year tour on the condition that the Soviet Union pay for his family to come over. When Michael's second tour of duty was over, he was prevented from leaving by bureaucratic barriers placed by the Soviet authorities, and he was trapped with his family. The Dolgun family lived in Moscow during the Great Purge of the late 1930s, and the Second World War. In 1943, Alexander was 16 and working at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. In December 1948, he was still a U.S. citizen, was still employed at the U.S. Embassy. While on his lunch break, he was suddenly taken into custody by the Soviet State Security Agency, the MGB. He was held in the Lubyanka and Lefortovo prisons in Moscow. He was falsely accused of espionage against the Soviet Union, and was put through a year of sleep and food deprivation, as well as psychological and physical torture intended to coerce a confession. After successfully enduring this trial, Dolgun was transferred to Sukhanovka, a monastery that had been converted into a prison. He survived more months of torture and was one of a very few to survive the prison with their sanity intact. His time in Sukhanovka brought him close to death, and he was transferred to the hospital at Batyurki prison to recover. His situation and whereabouts were known by Truman, Eisenhower and the U.S. government, but they didn't take any action for fear of the Soviet government harming Dolgun. Dolgun was sentenced to 25 years hard labor. He ended up at Zhezkazgan, in Kazakhstan, where he was held for several months until being called back to Moscow. His recall was authorized by Colonel Mikhail Ryumin, number 2 in the Soviet Union's State Security Department, and the engineer of the doctor's plot. Ryumin intended to use Dolgun as a puppet in a show trial. He was sent to Sukhanovka, again, where Ryumin personally tortured and beat him in an effort to get him to confess to a number of plots and conspiracies against the Soviet Union. Dolgun endured this for several months, but did sign several forced confessions. Interest in him declined and he was shipped back to Zhezkazgan. Conditions there improved after Stalin's death on March 5, 1953. After his release in 1956, he returned to Moscow. Under his release conditions he wasn't allowed to contact the American authorities. He also found out that his parents had been tortured in an attempt to pressure them into implicating him, driving his mother to insanity. He took a job translating medical journals into English for the Soviet Health Bureau and befriended several notable Gulag survivors, including Georg Tenno and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn included some of Dolgun's experiences in his famous work The Gulag Archipelago. Dolgun married a woman named Irene in 1965 and they had a son named Andrew in 1966. His mother died in 1967, and his father the next year. In 1971, through the efforts of his sister Stella, who escaped from the Soviet Union in 1946, and Ambassador John P. Humes, he managed to get an exit visa and moved to Rockville, in Maryland, where he worked at the Soviet-American medicine section of the Fogarty International Center at the National Institutes of Health. In 1975, he published the book, Alexander Dolgun's Story, An American in the Gulag, co-written with a man named Patrick Watson, and recounted his Gulag experiences in detail. His health was severely affected by his imprisonment, and he suffered from many health problems. In 1972, he received back pay of $22,000 from the U.S. Embassy for his period of service spanning 1949 to 1956. But he complained he was paid what he called peanuts for his time and should have received interest on his salary at the least. He died on August 28, 1986, in Potomac, Maryland, in the United States, aged 59. His cause of death was kidney failure. He was survived by his wife, Irene, and son Andrew.